Hey guys, okay, so let's start with the class proper, which, as I said in the introduction video, is going to be focusing both on Leo Bersani and on Kevin Killian. They're not writers who are necessarily connected, but they're both queer men, and they're both writers who were very much engaged with the situation of the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and subsequently. Bersani is someone who is extremely highly academically trained. He taught at a number of Ivy League colleges and in the US, and he published a number of very highly regarded, as you'll have seen, or as you'll see from the essay that I've given you to read, um, a lot of very beautifully written and also very dense and quite difficult, but I would argue also very rewarding material on subjects ranging from Freud to Baudelaire to contemporary painting. His essay, "Is the Rectum a Grave?" is one of, to me, one of the most memorable essays about AIDS that I know of, and I think it's a good starting point to talk about the AIDS epidemic in a way that will, for this course, it'll stretch across at least two classes, this class and then the class on Derek Jarman that follows it. And it's obviously something that will recur throughout the remainder of the classes. I think sometimes when we read histories of queer life, especially life in America and Europe, we hear references to pre and post Stonewall. So the Stonewall riot, which is often seen as a turning point in in terms of gay rights, and also in terms of a kind of queer visibility, a moment in which queer life moved outside of the dissimulations that we see in things like Wieners and the kinds of very ethically unsettling representations that we might see in a portrait of Jason, and into more of a kind of self-organization. Stonewall is spoken about as if it was this moment of shift, this sea change. And the other moment, or the other thing, which is spoken about as defining queer life in the second half of the 20th century, I would argue, is the AIDS epidemic. So we are going to be devoting a significant amount of time to its representations, to the questions that it posed politically, and also to the way in which artists and theorists wrote about it, and what they considered it to be revealing, both about society at large and about the role of homosexual men and women within that society. So we will start with "Is the Rectum a Grave?", which is the first essay in the collection that I put on eCampus. This one, Leo Bersani, "Is the Rectum a Grave?" and Other Essays. So for the class, I would suggest that you just read this first essay, but if you want to read the rest of them, or if you want to engage more in Bersani's work, then there are the rest of the essays in this collection are also pretty special. Yeah, I think that Bersani is a pretty exceptional writer. Some of the stuff that he says is definitely definitely has its critics. So I will leave it up to you guys if you want to form a critique of some of the way that Bersani writes about race, for example, or some of the ways that he some of the negativity that he expresses towards things like queer community and queer integration. There's a moment in this essay where he, much as we saw in the Bad Gays text, he's very critical of the idea that radical sex leads, quote unquote, to radical politics. So he says, an assumption that radical sex means or leads to radical politics, many gay men could, in the late 60s and early 70s, begin to feel comfortable about having unusual or radical ideas about what's okay in sex, without modifying one bit their proud middle-class consciousness or even their racism. Men whose behavior at night at the San Francisco Cauldron or the New York Mineshaft could win 5-star approval from the mostly straight theoreticians of polysexuality had no problem being gay slumlords during the day, and in San Francisco, for example, evicting from the Western Addition black families unable to pay the rents necessary to gentrify that neighborhood. And when I say that Bersani may be criticized for some of the ways that he writes about race, I don't think there's anything racist in his writing. I actually think that his writing has a lot of solidarity with African American people as a demographic. But largely, his language now perhaps seems quite dated. So, for example, instead of using the term African American or using the term black, he uses the term blacks, which has more of a ring to it of sounding a little bit old-fashioned, and he presents blacks as a kind of electoral force in the U.S. And he talks about their sheer number and their increasing participation in the vote, saying they are no longer a disposable constituency in those very states that have the most illustrious record of racial discrimination. And I want to draw attention to this stuff at the start before we consider the other arguments in this essay, which are to do with queer life in response to AIDS. Because I do think that it's possible to misread some of these statements as perhaps minimizing anti-black violence in the US, which is justifiably a very common and very important topic of conversation in contemporary conversations about America, for example. So when he makes an argument that in some way African Americans are valued as a kind of demographic in and of themselves because they have a kind of electoral influence caused by their increasing participation in the vote, whereas, for example, homosexual men do not have that. There is nothing, he says, well, like most of the whites, they have developed a technique for not seeing the gays, have no claims to power at all. So something that he's arguing is that the AIDS epidemic demonstrates the extent to which homosexuality as an identity and the extent to which gay men as a kind of demographic are irrelevant to the US and are actively, their death is welcomed in a way that Bersani is arguing that not all African Americans can be treated in this way as a result of their electoral power. So he says, in short, a few blacks will always be saved from the appalling fate of most blacks in America, whereas there is no political need to save or protect any homosexuals at all. The point that Bersani is making is that as a demographic, African Americans do possess a kind of electoral influence that that gay Americans, at least at the time that that this was being written in 1987, did not possess. I wanted to flag this up now because I don't think that it's the case that this minimizes the the extensive nature of anti-black violence in the US. However, I am aware that it may be possible to read it as doing that. So I wanted to, I think both Bersani's language and sometimes his rhetoric can feel a little bit outdated, but essentially I think that he's on the right side. But I didn't want to let that slip under the radar to make it seem as if I was ignoring it, if that stuck out to anyone as you were reading the essay. But having said that, what is the Rectum Grave about? What is this essay trying to discuss? We can see it's written in 1987. It's really at one of the heights of the AIDS epidemic, and it's at a point at which the extent of both the death which is involved in the epidemic and the indifference of the of ruling governments is, especially in America and the UK, and especially in America, is becoming more and more clear. Lots and lots of people are dying, and it's obvious that, generally speaking, people don't care in power. People in power do not care about the fact that lots and lots of gay men are dying of virus, dying of AIDS. And the thing that I wanted to zone in on to begin with, because this has consequences for how we read what Kevin Killian is trying to do later, which we'll get onto in the second half of the class. And Bersani makes a number of points early on. He says here that he gives an example of what he calls a malignant aversion, and malignant is harmful. If something is malignant, it means that it's harmful. And then he thinks about this in relation to AIDS, specifically the way in which what he terms a public health crisis, which public health is a term in English. I'm not sure if there's a direct translation in French, but it just means it concerns the health of the population as a whole. I'll zoom this in a bit. And what we mean by that is that everyone in some way is either affected by AIDS, or AIDS is something which could and should be considered along the lines of any other kind of epidemic which could affect the entire population. But due to its association with homosexuality, it's become coded, or it is coded, along the lines of a kind of what Bersani describes here as a sexual threat. So there's something explicitly sexual about the way that AIDS is being represented in general discourse, and there's something threatening about the kinds of sexualities which are being associated with AIDS. And we have this quote that Bersani uses from this text. Sorry, I'll just delete that one. It's from a footnote. From this text called Policing Desire, which I will return to a few times. And he says that AIDS is not only a medical crisis, it involves a crisis of representation itself. So what do we mean by a crisis of representation, or in what way might AIDS be a crisis of representation? And I think something that Bersani means, he's quoting Watney here, but something that Watney means and that Bersani wants to emphasize about AIDS is the extent to which the manner in which it's being represented in 1987 is inseparable from a broader representation of the homosexual community in general, of gay men especially, but also of gay women as being sexually deviant and as being threatening, and that those who wish to, and is in some way deserving, what it is that's happening to them. And as those who wish to write critically about this, and there's another point, I think it's in this essay, Bersani says that he quotes, no, he says it himself, I share Watney's interpretive interest, but it is also important to say that morally, the only necessary response to all this is rage. So he says the only necessary response to the indifference to the death which is going on in America and other places in the world and in the UK, but the epidemic is at its height in America, is rage at the callousness of governments and at the refusal to treat AIDS as a public health crisis and to make it into a crisis about the immoral nature of homosexual acts with which the virus is associated, but with which it has no necessary connection. As anyone who knows anything about AIDS knows, it's transmitted through either sexual contact or through blood-on-blood contact, and there is no higher probability of contracting the virus through sex with through same-sex contact as there is through heterosexual contact. Nonetheless, Bersani writes about situations in which doctors have refused to operate on people known to be infected with the AIDS virus. Schools have forbidden children with AIDS to attend classes, and recently, citizens of the idyllically named town of Arcadia, Florida, set fire to the house of a family with 3 hemophiliac children, apparently infected with HIV. Bersani has a very dry sense of humor, I would say, in his writing. So there's a clear sarcasm here and the correlation between this supposedly idyllically named aspect of Florida, or town in Florida, and the fact that they're burning down a house with 3 children inside it because they think they have AIDS, as if that would mean anything. And this then moves from this representation of AIDS, which seems to be driving extreme homophobic actions, and also not that extreme homophobic actions existed way prior to AIDS as well, but nonetheless providing a kind of justification for this. The indifference of the Reagan administration, the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan, and this who was in power at the time, is writ large in this kind of in the kind of priorities that they demonstrate. The study of AIDS as something which is not necessarily to be cured, but is to be contained away from areas of the population which are considered to be healthy, or areas of the population which are considered to be morally upstanding in a way that those who are suffering from the AIDS virus, i.e. those who are assumed to be homosexual, or homosexuals who are assumed to be suffering from the AIDS virus, one became what we would call a metonym for another, which is when one thing stands in for something else. These people are kept away from the healthy, both in terms of morally clean and in terms of physically healthy areas of the population. And Bersani is, again, with a very clear sense of irony, says having the information necessary to lock up homosexuals in quarantine camps may be a higher priority in the family-oriented Reagan administration than saving the heterosexual members of American families from AIDS. Something that you'll notice as you read Bersani's work is that he is not a big fan of quote unquote family oriented politics, and there's a good reason for that. And he's not a big fan of traditional ideas of community either, because for him that involves often a kind of exclusion of others, or the positing of an otherness, which is necessarily outside of the kind of community which is being founded. So in some sense there's an irony here, that the Reagan administration is more interested in expending its resources surveilling the gay population in the US in a manner which will enable the essential quarantine in AIDS wards of people with AIDS, than it is in developing effective treatments, for example, for the AIDS virus, or than it is in promoting sexual health, or any of the other measures that have subsequently been proven to allow people to either live with AIDS or to allow the spreading of AIDS to slow down and to stop in a lot of cases now. So there's both an irony there that this is what the Reagan administration wants. It's more interested in locking up gay people than it is in protecting families from AIDS. But at the same time, there isn't really an irony here, because Bersani is using family-oriented in a way which is coded with a kind of deep conservatism and a deep hatred of anything which is considered to be anti-family. And if there's one thing that we can say about sexual relations between people of the same gender, it's that they do not, in and of themselves, produce offspring. Of course, there are many homosexual couples in the world who have children, but the sex act between two men or two women itself is not going to produce a child. And for Bersani, I think there is a very clear conservatism expressed in this family-oriented Reagan administration, which makes it more of a priority to express a kind of systematic hatred and violence towards gay people than in actually taking measures around AIDS as if it were a public health crisis, which would also obviously affect the lives of heterosexual families too. And he suggests, again, and Bersani is a Freudian. Bersani is someone who is very sympathetic to an idea that people are subject, not entirely subject, but often subject to to some pretty dark and violent impulses, and that we can see these dark and violent impulses on a social scale. And he suggests, again, such a priority suggests a far more serious and ambitious passion for violence than what are, after all, the rather banal but rather normal sun-killing impulses of Robert Simpson. And Robert Simpson, we read earlier in the essay, a little bit earlier in the essay, is maybe taking me to the index. Is some we're on the wrong page. Sorry guys, bear with me. Robert Simpson, we read earlier. Let me find it. Is someone who has said that he would rather shoot his son than allow him to Yeah, there we go. I'd shoot my son if he had AIDS, said Svika. You know, it's not a very, doesn't take a lot to say that that is a deeply unstable and troubled thing to say. But at the same time, Bersani is arguing that we actually see a much more serious passion for violence in the way that the Reagan administration itself is handling the AIDS epidemic. And again, we see this repeated throughout the essay. We see a emphasis on the surveillance of individuals with AIDS, and we see what he calls a series of displacements, which are a series of moments in which violent impulses are displaced or put onto a kind of or put onto the sufferers of AIDS in a way which enables the virus and the people who are suffering from it to become a kind of screen upon which individuals can project their own negative feelings and their own violent impulses and their own moralism. There's a section earlier in the essay in which Bersani talks about the fact that gay men are now spoken about in the same kind of language that 19th century sex workers would previously have been spoken about. On page 17, he says the public discourse about homosexuals since the AIDS crisis began has a startling resemblance to the representation of female prostitutes in the 19th century as contaminated vessels conveying female venereal diseases to innocent men. So, Bersani is in no way playing down the misogyny which is behind the representation of female sex workers in the 19th century here, but what he's doing is showing the way in which these displacements, these projections of violence onto a population function as something which always involves a kind of specific moral judgment, and which avoids the point, or which avoids actually alleviating the symptoms of whatever situation is occurring, for example. So here we have a situation in which a government talks more about testing than it does about research and treatment. It is more interested in those who might eventually be threatened by AIDS, so again, the family-oriented focus here, than in those already stricken with it. To be struck by something or to be stricken with something is to be made ill by it. It's to be you can be stricken, you can be struck or stricken by a serious disease, which is often life-threatening. And he continues, there are hospitals in which concern for the safety of those patients who have not been exposed to HIV takes precedence over caring for those suffering from an AIDS-related disease. So again, we have this sense that priorities are skewed here. Things are topsy-turvy, we might say in English, which means the wrong way round. Upside down. So instead of treating people with AIDS, the entire setup is feeding into representations of the virus. And again, this is something that I want to stress when we'll go on and read Kevin Killian next, is that this whole thing is feeding into representations of the virus, which are more about managing the perceived threatening population which is associated with the virus, than about actually producing and dealing with effective cures or effective treatments. And the entire what Preciado, following Foucault, would call the entire biopolitical system is set up in order to contain and manage those suffering from AIDS, to protect and to neutralize the perceived threat that they pose to quote unquote healthy families, specifically families usually. This is something which is very much inflects on the way in which AIDS is represented, and which makes the representation of AIDS in a way that we will talk about in relation to Kevin Killian's work, something which is an open question. It's not immediately obvious how one represents AIDS in a way that can be true and can be honest, while also allowing for the fact that the virus is coded so strongly in a kind of deeply homophobic language, or the representations of the virus are coded so strongly in a kind of deeply homophobic language. And we're skipping over a lot of the arguments in Is the Rectum a Grave about homosexual sexuality and a kind of anti-community stance that Bersani is very interested in. He's very interested in what we might call negativity, in something which is not purely positive, something in a kind of stance towards sex which is interesting, because it's not about affirming the self. It's not even necessarily about having a nice or an enjoyable experience, but it's actually connected to a kind of self-dissolution. And I'll just gloss this bit because it's difficult to understand and it's not super important for what I want to talk about, but it is the climax of the essay right at the end. And he says the self is a practical convenience, promoted to the status of an ethical idea. It is a sanction for violence, and a sanction in this way. A sanction is a curious word because it can mean both a block on something and permission to do something. So if I said there is a sanction imposed on me, there is a sanction imposed on this country, it would mean the country's economy is blocked in some way. If I said I have a sanction to do this, it means I have permission to do it. So it's one of the few words in English that has two contradictory meanings. But he says the self is a sanction for violence, and what he means by this is that the self is something, this sense of a firm self, the sense of something that needs to be protected against a potentially malevolent and morally corrupt and disease-affected outside, is something that becomes a kind of sanction for violence. And he sees this operating throughout the response to the AIDS epidemic in the US. And then we'll just skip to the end, and he says, male homosexuality advertises the risk of the sexual itself as the risk of self-dismissal, of losing sight of the self, and in so doing it proposes and dangerously represents jouissance, which means enjoyment, same word, as it is in French, as a mode of ascesis. And ascesis is self-denial. To be ascetic, and to be ascetic is to be like a monk. To deny your bodily desires, or to deny yourself. So he's suggesting that there's something about male homosexuality to do with the way that it's coded, and also to do with the way that he thinks it's experienced. And like I say, we don't really have time to go into the details on this, but you can read it in the essay, which involves a kind of dissolution of the self. The self, which he argues is more often than not a kind of sanction for violence. So we can think about this in terms of Butler too. As you'll read in the essay, Bersani is not interested in performativity in the way that Butler is interested in, for example, drag. Bersani, I don't think, thinks that that the kind of parodies of masculinity that one might see in voguing and in drag, and which is often an important part of queer culture, this kind of excessive imitation of something, which Butler is very interested in, as a kind of evidence of performativity, of this idea that, it's all about the actions that you do, it's not about some kind of internal core. Bersani is not interested in that in the same way. I don't think he thinks it has much radical potential. And he says here, parody is an erotic turnoff, and all gay men know this. Much campy talk is parodistic, and while that may be fun as a dinner party, if you're out to make someone, you turn off the camp. So for him, eroticism and homosexual eroticism is something more negative than this. It's something which moves more against community, and which doesn't unsettle the self, because it kind of challenges gender norms, as Butler might argue that that drag does, or that obvious performances do, performances of different gender identities. But there is something about homosexual sex which he argues in certain cases involves losing sight of a self, and in doing so involves losing sight of the kind of sanction for violence that the self, for Bersani, brings with it. And we see this writ large in relation to the AIDS epidemic, in which certain kinds of codified selves, certain kinds of conservative subjects and people are protected at the expense of actually treating and dealing with the virus itself, as if it were a public health crisis, rather than, as Bersani says, a sexual threat. Okay, so the next part of the class, we're just going to, again, it's going to be a bit of a gloss, but I wanted to introduce you to Kevin Killian's writing, and to give you a sense of the way that he interacted with AIDS, and also the relationship between Killian's writing and pop culture too, which is very, very important, and the movement of which he's a part, and which he was kind of an instrumental member, is known as the New Narrative movement, which was a kind of queer, often queer, not exclusively queer, but often queer experimental writing, prose and poetry in the US from kind of the 80s onwards, and often very invested in ideas of pop culture and the representation of pop culture. And again, the question of representation in relation to AIDS is something that we will consistently come back to, and it's a question that really informs the way that we're going to discuss some of Killian's poems. Killian wrote memoirs, he wrote novels, he also wrote thousands and thousands. He wrote, I think he wrote over 1,000. He wrote a lot anyway, of Amazon reviews, of different books and different products, which I would really, really recommend seeking these out. They're really amusing. They're really cleverly written. Actually, I may as well just show you some of them now. And he posted them on Amazon itself. And this is a review that he wrote of a book by Anthony Bourdain, the chef. No, it's not. It's a review of a book that he wrote by Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, which contains a long joke about Anthony Bourdain, the chef. Not going to read it now, but I would really recommend looking at Kevin's reviews. They're hilarious and are in themselves a kind of experimental literature, which I think at points is very beautiful. Some of them have been published as small books, what we call chapbooks, which are usually small books of poetry, usually printed by a small press, not a major publisher. I don't know why they're called chapbooks, but they are. So yeah, it's the kind of thing that Kevin Killian wrote, but he also wrote a number of memoirs, novels, and probably his most well-known sequence of poetry is this sequence called Argento series, which was published in 2001, but which was very much Killian's response to the AIDS epidemic, which for a homosexual man, woman, anyone invested in the queer community or involved in the queer community in the US. For Killian, this was in San Francisco, but it could equally have been in other cities, involved watching a lot of your friends die. And watching a lot of your friends die in a way whereby their deaths couldn't be spoken about openly, in a way in which their deaths left an extremely, aside from being deeply traumatic experiences, there was also a question of how to represent this, how to mourn this, how to really even think about this in art, given the kind of complexities of representation and given the aspects of the public response to the AIDS crisis that we've been speaking about. And on the back cover of Killian's book Argento series, which unfortunately I don't have a physical copy of, I only have the scan that I've shared with you guys, so I don't actually know what the back cover looks like, but I have found this quotation from it. Killian has a statement saying, 1991, Kevin frozen, unable to think of a way to write about AIDS crisis. 1992, Kathy Acker, who some of you may know is also an extremely well-regarded figure in the queer experimental writing scene in the US. She's one of the most influential and most loved writers in that scene, still to this day. Suggests films of Dario Argento as a prism through which to take apart the horror of living and dying in AIDS. So I don't know, I'm guessing that some of you will know who Argento is, some of you may have seen an Argento movie. His most famous film is Suspiria, which if you haven't seen it, I would really strongly recommend. If you like horror films or if you're interested in cinema in general, Suspiria is pretty amazing. But Killian is saying that he is using Argento's movies, which would not be regarded as high art and still are not regarded as high art. They're kind of trashy horror movies that make use of a series of very precise kind of genre tropes, we could say. So a trope is a common pattern in culture, in a cultural object, or common feature of a particular genre. It's like one step below a cliche. I'm sure some of you knew that already, but so he's going to write through Argento, and he's going to use Argento as a way of, in some way, being able to represent what it meant to live through AIDS, not only as a crisis in which many people who Killian knew and loved had died, but also as a kind of crisis in representation itself. And again, quoted in an article that I will upload to eCampus, Killian says, writing about his poems and writing about the people who feature in them, he says, I could see their ghosts trembling at the edges of vision. It began to be a book of death and mourning. I began to feel this alternative presence all around me. I did not know of which I began to speak. So Killian is suggesting that writing Argento series is a way of engaging with a unsettled, or with unmourned for friends, unmourned for lovers, many of whom would have been the same thing. Or many of whom would have been both friends and lovers at different point in Killian's life. And to be able to, or the process of writing these poems, it's not intended as a way of moving on from AIDS, I think that Killian is suggesting here, as if that were possible. And it's not intended as a way of moving on from the people whom Killian has lost as a result of the AIDS epidemic and as a result of the management of it and kind of genocidal ways that we have seen Bersani writing about. But it's a way of engaging aesthetically with the continued existence of these people in their death and with what Killian refers to as their ghosts, as their continued persistence. And I'll also publish this. I'll put this article online as well by Adam Mitz, which I think is a really nice essay on Killian's. So I should have an apostrophe on it. On Argento series and what it's trying to do and what maybe we can think of its aims as being. And Adam Mitz says that the kind of poetic reanimation of the dead, alongside the ekphrastic displacement of memory, allow Killian to write elegy in a way that provides space for personal and communal mourning while avoiding elegiac closure. So that's a bit wordy, but we can explain it. So ekphrastic comes from ekphrasis, which is a way of writing about a work of art often a picture, but not exclusively, which makes that work of art tangible. Tangible to the reader. And elegiac is connected to elegy, which is it's a poem, usually a poem of mourning, written after the death of someone. So when we're talking about elegiac closure, we're talking about the kind of successful mourning, the kind of closure that one might achieve if one were to mourn someone and then to move on from them in the form by writing an elegy. It both commemorates them, but it also enables the writer and the reader to move forward with their lives. This is something that Mitt is suggesting that Killian wants to avoid in the book Argento Sequence. This closure, rather, what he wants to do is to try and remember the people whom he's lost, rather than bury them. But in order to do that, he makes use of the films of Argento as a way of shielding himself from the traumatic nature of his memories. So by writing about Argento at the same time as writing about AIDS, Killian is able to actually write about AIDS without the kind of shield of Argento, this kind of kitsch but very identifiable and enjoyable horror movie director. The actual severity of Killian's memories would be too much, is what Mitz is suggesting. So he says he uses the films of Dario Argento as a protective shield for the wax paper of his poems, which might otherwise be injured or rendered incoherent or illegible by the painful impress of his memories. And in the final part of the class, I just want to do a bit of a close reading of how, of some of the poems, just to see the way in which Killian's aesthetic is working in the book, and the way in which he is simultaneously drawing attention to what, he describes as the horror of living and dying in AIDS era, taking that apart, so dissecting that, showing what that was like. And at the same time doing this while summoning images of dead friends, being able to participate in memories that might otherwise be too traumatic to participate in, and the way in which kind of references to film and other references to pop culture that we'll look at, the way in which these references give Killian a way of moving through these memories, which enables them to be the subject for poems that otherwise would be impossible to write for him. So we'll just look at a few of these poems and then we'll wrap up the class. And yeah, this is more of a introduction to Killian's work than it is a serious engagement with it, because unfortunately we just don't have the time. But obviously those of you who are interested in this should go ahead and read more of Killian's work and of the writers associated with him. There are a number of anthologies of new narrative writing, for example, which are extremely interesting, and there's a lot of really great new narrative writers out there. So, this poem, Tracking Shot, is something that we can look at if we want to get a sense of how this this intermingling of a kind of cinematic language, specifically a language of horror cinema and of Italian horror cinema that Argento is most associated with, and death, and the loss and mourning, how these things intersect. So, the job unfinished, the killer's POV. POV, I'm sure you know, means point of view. There are a number of point of view shots in Argento's films, in which you see the victim through the eyes of the killer, or you see the killer moving through the house. Thunderous Goblin music is a reference to Goblin the band, who soundtracked Suspiria and another of Argento's films, Profondo Rosso or Deep Red, which is referenced in these two poems too. The soundtrack for Suspiria is amazing. If anyone doesn't know it already and is interested, it's one of the all-time great movie soundtracks, in my opinion, and in the opinion of plenty of other people too who know more about film than I do. But now, so we move from what appears to be a description of shots that could be in a film. The killer's POV, long hair blowing in the wind, nameless, an excellent target for bazookas, whatever that means. Thunderous goblin music, a description of a soundtrack. But then we have, at the moment between now and falling asleep, the ghost Russian. I'm 45, time for ghosts, the dead fluttering their scarves. Like Isadora, Duncan, snap. Head popped off, sails against the screen like popcorn in the big glass warm box. Boy's nose pressed against it, watching to the thunderous goblin music. We kind of move in and out of what appears to be a filmic experience here into something that feels much more like the reemergence of a kind of a loss, which is felt by the speaker of Killian's poem. This reference to between now and falling asleep, the ghosts rush in. This no longer feels like it's a reference to the film. I'm 45, time for ghosts, the dead fluttering their scarves. To flutter means to move about in the wind. A flag can flutter, for example, or often a scarf flutters as well. And again, this line "time for ghosts" suggests that that Killian is old enough at 45 to have known a lot of dead people. A 45-year-old man close to queer communities in America and elsewhere in the 90s when he's writing these poems. It's published in 2001, the book, but the poems stretch back as we saw to 1991 at least. Would have known a lot of dead people, a lot of ghosts, and they are fluttering their scarves, like Isadora, Duncan. And again, Isadora, the way that naming works in these poems is interesting because there's a full stop, as we see, between Isadora and Duncan, in a way that suggests both that Isadora is a name, which perhaps the name of a ghost, perhaps the name of someone that Killian knew who is dead, but also Isadora Duncan is a famous celebrity and a dancer and an actress who Killian would have known of as a kind of celebrity. So what we have in this line is possibly a reference to someone that Killian has known. And then also the enactment of a kind of thought process. So the association goes from Isadora to Isadora Duncan. Or is it two people called Isadora and Duncan? And then we're kind of back in the film. Head popped off, sails against the screen like popcorn fresh in the big glass warm box. Boy's nose pressing against it, watching to the thunderous goblin music. And this is a reference to a moment in Profondo Rosso in which someone writes the name of the killer on a bathtub and someone blows on it, and because of the way that the steam works, they can see the name. It's not on a bathtub, it's on some tiles, sorry. He says, I blow on it, the text disappears, the name of the killer up over the house. I'll call him my houseboy, the killer laughs to thunderous goblin music. And again, the name of the killer. Is this AIDS? All she can write is H, and looked at it another way, it is I, and upside down, kicking V. In the scene in Profondo Rosso, a woman has been killed by the killer, but before she dies, the name she writes takes a bit of decoding. But again, this process, this kind of aesthetic trope and representation provides Killian with a way of writing about HIV, the killer, the thing which is responsible for the death of the people that he knows. And he says, "I'm reading these signs of the infidel hates me." The term HIV, its relationship to AIDS, is something which, again, Killian seems to understand in this writing, or the speaker of Killian's poem seems to understand in this writing, as something that marks him out as hateable, as morally reprehensible. And again, this is something that he accesses through the description of a scene and the references to a scene in a relatively obscure 1980s trashy horror movie. I have to speed up a little bit. We have this. One of the people who is very important in Killian's life and is an exceptional writer in her own right, and is referenced in almost all of Killian's work, as he is in her and a lot of hers, is Dodie Bellamy, who... non, j'ai fait un web call en fait.
As this level, you have to turn off the light.
Oui, je comprends.